Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in this video what I want to do is talk about front-end libraries. Um, Basically, if you've been getting involved in web development, you probably after a while learn about sort of the way things work now, where basically the back end and the front end are kind of completely separate applications. You usually have a back end application that serves an API. And then separately, you create your front end application that then consumes that API. And the benefit of this is that that same API can then later on be used for your mobile app or used for a device, all sorts of other uses. So you can reuse the same API because they're not inherently connected. When you sort of build in your front end into your back end app. Now, there are a lot of different front end frameworks you always hear people talk about, and sometimes it can be overwhelming to understand, okay, what should I learn? At the end of the day, you should at least dabble a little bit in everything, because that way you have an idea of what's out there. But this video is going to try to give you kind of a primer on what's out there on the big ones. So, first, let's talk about Angular, which the website is angular.io for sort of modern Angular, which is Angular, currently Angular 9. And basically what you have here is what Angular is created by Google. And the Angular is a much more robust framework. So this is why like a lot of larger companies like Angular, because Angular is not just, okay, how do you build your UI, but also handles like how do you make an API call, how do you handle routing. It has everything kind of built into it. So generally, for every aspect of building your front end, there's an Angular solution. Now, why do big companies like that? Because big companies want to know that if they need to replace a developer, they can replace a developer. And with Angular, since everything has a way to do it, the next developer who uses Angular can do it the Angular way. They're not going to come up with some sort of other way of doing things. So it allows one Angular developer to be much more easily replaceable by another Angular developer, which makes this sort of a popular choice with larger companies. Now, as a developer, it does mean you have to learn a lot more because you have to learn everything Angular offers. You can learn a little bit and do some things, but over time, you need to kind of learn everything Angular offers, which takes a lot more time. So it's kind of the one with like the hardest sort of learning curve, but a lot of bigger companies like it, not because developers love it, but because it provides that sort of uniform experience, one set of tools for doing everything. Okay. Now, as far as my personal opinion, as far as like a developer experience, I love React.js. Okay, so let's go to React's website. Okay, wait, I want to go to the main site. And React is a lot more at its core minimalist. It focuses on one thing: how do you build your UI? How do you build your user interface? And whether you're using Angular or React, everything is component based. So the idea is that you take your UI and you break it to little pieces. So essentially, think of like this header as a component. Take a look at this hero as a component. Each of these little kind of cards are a component. And everything's broken down into these little components that then you can reuse as building blocks. They just give you different ways of doing that. But React really just kind of focuses on the component building. So far as how do you do an API call, that's up to you. You could use the built-in fetch API, you could use Axios, you could use some other library, but it's up to you. And how do you do routing? How do you do all these different questions? Oftentimes, there are sort of standard answers, but there are more than one answer. There's not necessarily a canon React answer. And what's nice about that is it allows you to kind of find your React workflow that works for you. Okay, so there's not just one way to do things, there's lots of ways to do things. But it also means if you're a larger company that your developers might be more diverse in the way they do things, which makes it harder to replace one developer with another developer because the other developer did things one way and the next developer does things another way. So it's not quite as easy a switch. Even then though, React is probably the biggest right now as far as front-end frameworks because it's fast and it's a really pleasant development experience. It's really easy to work with. It's just really cool. And this was created by Facebook. And then the third one is called Vue, or Vue, Vue.js.org. This is the only one that doesn't have like a large company backing behind it. And basically, it was, I think it was, the guy's name is Evan You who created Vue. So it was one guy competing against Facebook and Google and doing it successfully. So Vue doesn't have as much market share as Google's Angular or React's or Facebook's React, but it has a sizable share of the market. There are jobs in developing websites with Vue, and it's growing in popularity because it's easy to learn. Okay, it's just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if you were to use sort of the rollout template for any of these frameworks, if you use Angular, everything is in separate files. So you have a separate file for your HTML template, you have a separate file for your CSS, and then you have a separate file for all your JavaScript logic. Okay, so every component, every chunk of your UI is done in a separate chunk, in separate files. So it's 3 files per component. Now, when you're doing it in React, you could have it all in one file for a component. You can have, it just depends on how you do it. Sometimes you have it in 2 files. You might have your JavaScript file, have your logic and your template in what's called JSX, and then have a separate CSS file that gets bundled in. Or you could style it inline. Again, React gives you a lot of options. In Vue, you create like a Vue file, and that Vue file has everything, but they're in different sections. So you have your HTML here and like a section that's called where your template is. So it's just straight up HTML. Then you have a script tag with all your JavaScript, and then you have a style tag with all your CSS. So it just feels like you're basically just making an HTML file, but it works. So it's a really easy to pick up because it makes sense. Okay, all my JavaScript in the script tag, all my CSS in the style tag, and then all my template just in straight up HTML. So that's pretty cool. And now there's a 4th framework that actually takes that approach as well and kind of makes it even easier. Svelte. But Svelte is pretty new. So there's not really much in the way of jobs in Svelte yet, but it's super popular among developers, or growing in popularity really quickly with developers, because it takes sort of that nicer workflow of Vue, but makes it even simpler. And then because it compiles, so the difference is with React, Vue, and Angular, you don't compile the code. So you're shipping the framework with your code. So that means on top of all the code that you wrote, you're shipping off all the Vue, React, Angular code. So, that increases what's called your bundle size, which increases the time of your initial load. Okay? So it increases the time of your initial load. The cool thing about Svelte is that you run it through a compiler that just basically injects all plain vanilla JavaScript logic into a final version of your project, so there's no framework you have to ship out. So in that case, your initial bundle size is a lot smaller, which means your initial load is faster. Okay, and then again, the underlying site is also pretty fast as well. Okay, so again, there's always 2 load times you have to worry about. So your initial load, that's going to be affected by your bundle size, how big all the files that's needed to run your website or your application. And 2, runtime speed or execution speed, meaning just like, okay, how complicated is the actual code that it just ends up running really slow because it's running way too many commands. So there's always those 2 things to consider about. And Svelte provides a really nice solution to that. So again, these are sort of the 4 mainstream sort of front-end frameworks. But then what's happened over time is a couple of years ago is that they've introduced what's called the Web Component API into the browser, which allows you to have that component-based design to be able to create these chunks of code that's like all built into each other. You can now do that just with native JavaScript, with the native browser API. Okay, so there's a couple different frameworks that have actually taken that into to heart. So first I'll show you Stencil JS. So Stencil is kind of like Svelte in the sense that it's a compiler, except it doesn't compile your code to just plain JavaScript. It compiles it to web components using the web component standard. So you can actually create web components that you can then reuse, and you can reuse them anywhere. And the cool thing is that the web component API is standard and built into a browser, so you don't have to ship a framework with it. You can just plop it into your React project, plop it into your Vue project, and they'll treat it like a normal HTML tag because it's registered with the browser. So Stencil is one tool for using that. Stencil kind of has a workflow. It's a mix between React and Angular. So like Angular, it has a kind of that split up of files, so HTML, CSS, whatnot, and it uses TypeScript, which Angular uses out of the box. But Stencil also uses JSX like React, so it uses like this weird HTML syntax that's referred to as JSX. So it's kind of like working in Angular and React at the same time. It's actually pretty cool. Okay, also using web components, you can use Google's lit element. Okay, lit element is a base class that Google created based on the, so basically when you build web components, you use this class called HTML element to create a new HTML element. That's how it works. So lit element is a base class created by Google for creating web components. Okay, yeah, that's, and then basically what it does, it uses a templating format called lit HTML to create your HTML templates. So that's that. And then the last few I'll tell you about are the libraries I've made. I've created some front-end UI libraries as well. And they're mainly based around the web component API. So if you go to alexmercedcoder.com/jslib, okay, you'll see here there's a bunch of different libraries. So MercedUI is sort of the big library I made based on the web component API, and it provides you a base class as well called Merced element. So you can actually just get the base class here if you really don't need all the other bells and whistles. The MercedUI library comes not only with the Merced element base class for creating web components, and the cool thing about the Merced element base class is that it has things that you might be used to from React, such as props and state built in. So if you like using React, but you want to use web components, this is actually a pretty cool option. And then has a lot of the other features you might like from other libraries in React, such as a router. I also have this class called the form tool that makes it really easy to work with forms. So there's a lot of stuff built into this tool set that is the MercedUI library. So I highly recommend trying that out. I think you'll like it. Okay, and then here are some other ones. These are some just simple component, Merced element. These are all other front-end libraries. They're just different takes on the same idea, with some minor differences in how certain features work. You can play around with them if you want. Better types and Merced utils are the only libraries here that are not front-end UI libraries. These are actually for like working with arrays, and mainly for working with arrays. It's kind of like they're like alternatives to Lodash. Lodash is a library with a bunch of array functions and other helper functions. Basic element is sort of is another base class that's just as simple as possible. So literally all it does is give you state and props. In MercedUI, the Merced element base class gives you a couple other extra bells and whistles. This is just pretty straightforward, adding those extra features, and then that's that. Component Zoo is like all this stuff in one. Yeah, that's pretty much like a collection of all these base classes in one library. A fun component is a way to make web components through functions. So if you prefer like working in functions instead of building out classes, fun component, basically what it does, it wraps the web component API into a functional syntax. So that's cool. It's basically using the same stuff the other ones are, but just gives it a function wrapper. So that way you can use functions and not have to worry about classes and class syntax. But that all uses the web component API. And the only issue with the web component API is browser compatibility. People with really old browsers, we're talking about like IE9, they're not going to be able to interpret web components because their browsers don't have the web component API built in. So what I wanted to do is create a few UI libraries that take that into consideration. They actually don't use the web component API. And that's where I have mblocks and superfunc. They're not as easy to use as all of these because web component API is actually really easy to use. It makes it's pretty awesome. But it's pretty close. Okay, so it gives you some of the features, and the other benefit of mblocks and superfunc is that it doesn't require any of the tooling. If you're using Vue, React, Angular, Svelte, Stencil, there's always some sort of compiler, some sort of build steps you have to set up. There's a setup, that involves generally Webpack and Babel, So the idea was to create a library that doesn't use any of that. No Babel, no Webpack, no having to worry about build steps. It just works. You can just slap in a script tag, write some code, and you have some nice advanced logic to your UI. So mblocks and superfunc do that. They both kind of take the same approach. Again, the only difference here is that mblocks does it using classes, superfunc uses functions, and this is actually purely functional. So I'm not wrapping a class in a function this time around. It's purely done through through functions and function closures. So these are just other fun front-end UI libraries. So if you're a front-end geek like I am, well, I'm a front-end and back-end geek. I'm just a full-stack geek. But these are some fun ones to play. And plus, I always would love to hear some feedback on people trying to create stuff with this. And I do have tutorial videos on all of these libraries. So if you click on any of these, you'll find the GitHub, the NPM, the tutorial videos. So that way you can try these out. So hopefully this gives you a nice summary of all sort of the front-end options, all the mainstream front-end options, React, Angular, Vue, Stencil, Svelte, and then again there's also Lit Element, and then my host of libraries, which you can access at alexmercedcoder.com/jslib, meaning JavaScript library. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Have a great day. Enjoy. I'll see you guys later on. And yeah, have a good one.